And for the program today, there's going to be a couple of minor changes. Now, you may have noticed that we were going to be presenting the case study of living with the lambs. But in the interest of time and to allow us to have a longer Q&A so that we can take more questions from the audience, we've decided that Emma Coe will now take any questions that you have about living with the lambs during the Q&A. And Emma will instead present a case study on decolonizing funding. So without much further ado, first up, we have a pre-recorded video, Snatch the Pebble, by Daniel York Low on Yellowface and whitewashing, plus general issues of casting and behind-the-scenes inequities.
I grew up in an era of Yellowface. I sometimes wondered if East and Southeast Asian men just didn't do acting. If I ever saw East and Southeast Asian women on TV, they played exotic temptresses, sexual trophies for the white male hero, or dragon ladies and stern matriarchs.
Yes! Audition tomorrow. Chinese takeaway girl, short-tempered, surly, rude Asian accent.
Wow. You were born to play that part.
If you saw an East or Southeast Asian male, we were there to be an object of fear and loathing, or an object of ridicule with exaggerated performance and physicality. We were the opposite of normalized.
Hi, sorry.
Yes, can I help you?
Yeah, I was just wondering what you thought of my performance.
Oh, yeah, well, very good. Well done. I think you're going to have a wonderful career, old chap. When they remake Charlie Chan, you'll be well in.
I sometimes think that when we're asked to do Chinese accents or Japanese accents, they want us to imitate white actors doing Yellowface.
I am Chinese actor.
I went to drama school.
I will now ask my eager volunteer kindly to step into the cabinet of death,
where I did Shakespeare and John Ford and George Bernard Shaw and Ibsen and Strindberg and Tennessee Williams. When I left, I did all right at first.
I think it said Oriental male actor, and I applied for it and was given the audition address and to meet the director, Greg Way. And I'd seen him in Butterfly, which again was an incredible experience. So I'd say meeting him at that point, that play, it kind of changed my life in a lot of ways.
Then I went to the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Casting these locals as Miranda and Ariel in The Tempest, but the bard is hardly part of their heritage, is it?
Oh, I think they're ever so good. Personally.
I thought then I could be considered for stuff on TV. I thought I could play heroes and villains and clowns and adventurers and wild-eyed dreamers and dull bureaucrats and romantic lovers and boring husbands and people who worked in offices and people who flew spaceships and people who saved the world and people who destroyed the world and cops and robbers and bullies and victims and happy and sad and everything in between with some sort of beginning, middle and end.
Where's the comedy? And she said, well, it's a Chinese family running a takeaway. And I knew immediately what she meant. You know what I'm talking about, Jasper? I mean, we're talking about racist granny.
Yes.
But also about egg foo young, number 20, all the kind of stereotypic tropes of a family running a Chinese takeaway, which are inherently funny if it was racist.
素晴らしい.
I felt, wow, I'm on the cusp, and then it's just sunk, and you're basically back to Mr. Chan in the instant noodles commercial, and it's just been a lot like that, basically.
So you were doing Mr. Chan and noodle commercials in between for money kind of thing?
No, I never got those jobs, never.
You didn't get them?
No, I very rarely got them. No, I don't remember ever getting more than... I think they weeded me out quite quickly because I was half Chinese and you could really feel that. Literally, I'd walk into the room and you could feel them going, oh, and not being kind of their idea of what a Chinese person should be.
You're reading for the role of Mr. Chow, and I'd go through the script and try and find Mr. Chow. And Mr. Chow usually wasn't in it much, and he'd usually have very few lines, and those lines always seemed to be stilted and were never very interesting. Stay away from my sister. I am lost. Can you help me? You bring shame on our family, Malin. Or affecting a fairy tale voice to speak in fortune cookie language. To find a tree, you must enter a forest. And I'd usually get told, you're not Chinese enough, you're not Japanese enough, you're not Korean enough, you're not Vietnamese enough, you're not Indonesian enough, you're not foreign enough, basically.
Look, Danny, there are only two names anyone can call us chinks, and that's Jackie Chan or fucking Charlie Chan. Charlie Chan's fat with slanty eyes, and Jackie Chan's got muscles and knows kung fu. Now, which one would you rather fucking be called?
I'd rather fucking stay alive.
Sometimes they'd even look angry when I walked in the room and I wasn't Chinese enough, or Japanese enough, or Korean enough, or Vietnamese enough, or Indonesian enough, or foreign enough.
You know, when your agents said we got this Oriental guy, we thought that could be really interesting. Right, Ben?
One time, they complained about me. Why wasn't he larger than life, and why didn't he have a Chinese accent? Did he not read the brief? Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon? And I wondered if they'd fast-forwarded the bits where everyone was just talking to each other in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Those bits where they weren't fighting or flying or gurning or goofing. The bits where they fell in love and fell in friendship and fell in enmity and fell in nuance and life and story. Sit up straight, you're playing a Chinaman. Your accent, it sounds too Notting Hill. Could you just say that line in Chinese? It doesn't matter if it's Cantonese or Mandarin, we won't know the difference anyway. Oh, just a general Chinese accent. Your character doesn't say much. And people might think this all happened years ago, but honestly, when I watch the likes of One Child and Strangers and Chimerica and the Singapore Grip, and I was in one or two of those things, it's like I'm watching something from the 1980s or sometime. All of those series are set in Asian countries, so our casting opportunities are all about how believably foreign we can be to the white Western gaze. Most of those series have a white male protagonist, and often the East and Southeast Asian actors playing the main East or Southeast Asian supporting roles in those big series that are set in foreign countries that get our representation statistics up are flown in from other countries where they ironically get far more opportunities and are deemed to be more authentically Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese or Indonesian.
Snatch the pebble from my hand.
And most of the East or Southeast Asian actors in those big TV series set in foreign countries starring white male protagonists have to speak East or Southeast Asian languages.
Oh, and they want the whole thing in your language.
English.
No, they meant foreign. Any kind of Asian, basically.
And sometimes they have to learn to speak the East or Southeast Asian languages phonetically.
Won't they find out?
They don't speak Chinese, I don't either. How are they going to know?
They are literally acting in languages they don't understand, or approximating what people who don't speak those languages want to hear.
Well, as you know, we're going to be following the story of the main protagonist, Shotaro Kanedi, and he's going to try and find and bring back his childhood friend, Tetsuo Shima.
Sorry, it's just pronounced Shotaro Kaneda and Tetsuo Shima.
On one of those series, I heard they were pulling background artists out of the scene because they were deemed to look too mixed race. One commissioning executive told me it had to be that way because drama is not a documentary. And there's no footnotes.
What do you think?
I'm not too sure.
Me neither.
Me too, actually. Why do we think that?
The acting.
No, it's not the acting.
The other night I watched The Death of Stalin on TV, and I remembered the Channel 4 drama Chernobyl, and I remembered the lavish TV adaptation of War and Peace. And all of those dramas are set in Eastern Europe, and they're all in English. And then I started thinking about East and Southeast Asian political history and famous novels and huge geopolitical incidents. And I wondered why you couldn't take some of that East and Southeast Asian history and politics and literature and dramatise it with British-based East and Southeast Asian actors in English in their own accents. After all, is Asia more foreign than Russia? Or is it all about the colour of our skin? Because this would humanise people of East and Southeast Asian descent. and it would empower us to be actors rather than foreign signifiers. But then I wonder if the industry would ever accept that number of East and Southeast Asian actors from that many diverse backgrounds who had worked in the theatre and could act and portray actual three-dimensional characters rather than represent an otherness in accents we don't have or have to exaggerate in languages we don't speak. I'm wondering if the industry will recognise that tokenism is not diversity. I'm still wondering. My name's Daniel York Lowe. Thank you for your time.
Hold me tight, don't ever kill my light, don't ever lose that.
Yeah, so next up, we're going to crunch some numbers. We're very pleased to have Dr. Jamie Rogers, visiting academic at University of Warwick, will be sharing statistics relating to BC representation on British TV in 2018.
Morning. I would like to quickly note that I am female, wearing a lilac sweater, and have mid-length brown hair and glasses. So the pithy title for this brief lecture is Representation. What representation? And it's worth explaining that the flippancy of the title is related to the fact that as far as British East Asian and Southeast Asian representation on television is concerned, there is almost none. My data comes from an extensive research project commissioned by Equity's Race Equality Committee into diversity on broadcast television in 2018. Although the scope of it could not encompass every single program on television, a decision was made to monitor the peak scripted output on the 4 major broadcast channels, BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and Channel 4 for a whole calendar year, 2018. 992 episodes of television drama and comedy were monitored for their ethnic and gender breakdowns of on-screen performers. Next slide, please. For the year, the ethnic diversity breakdown for all programming was 82% white actors. British East Asian and Southeast Asian performers made up a mere 1% of all appearances in scripted programming in 2018. That again is 992 episodes of television that were monitored. Now, those are the raw data numbers that show the almost complete erasure of the British East Asian and Southeast Asian communities on the broadcast network's most prominent programming. My study deals entirely with numbers, so it was not able to completely answer the questions that Daniel York Lowe's short film that we've just seen brings up. But some of the data shows that there is a level of segregation of people of color into particular genres, including those dramas set in a foreign country. Now, in analyzing program level data, the year's output by the broadcasters was split into 5 broad genres: comedy, period drama, continuing drama, mystery, and contemporary drama. In 2 of these categories, these genre categories, the continuing drama, which you may recognize more as calling them soaps, and period drama, there was statistically 0% BC performers appearing in them. 0%. And in fact, just to give an extra piece of data here, in one program, in Casualty, there were only 3 appearances by an East Asian or Southeast Asian performer for the entire 53-week period that was monitored. But for the purposes right now, what I want to zoom in on in the very short time I have is the contemporary drama genre. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. This slide is a visual representation of the contemporary drama category. These programs had the highest percentage of BC at 3% of all appearances across all the programs in the genre. And contemporary drama also had the lowest percentage of white participation in them at 70%. And that is where Daniel York Lowe's observation about being portrayed as foreigners in places like Hong Kong comes into focus. There are clear indications that performers of color are segregated into a particular subgenre of contemporary drama. There were 4 programs in 2018 that were either set in Africa, India, or Hong Kong, and they made up the bulk of participation by actors of color in contemporary drama. These programs include Black Earth Rising, Our Girl, and the Good Karma Hospital. And the 4th program, and one that Daniel York Lowe briefly referenced, was Strangers, an ITV thriller set in Hong Kong. And Strangers had the highest number of BC performers in it of any program broadcast in prime time on the major networks in 2018. Now that's any program. Strangers meets all of the requirements for tokenism. A white lead and British actors of East Asian and Southeast Asian heritage playing characters who are foreign nationals, not British citizens. Many white characters were British, but not the characters played by British East Asian performers. Like Lowe said in the film, they played foreigners. The cast of Strangers, it was 40% white performers and 57% BC performers, and the other 3% came from African Caribbean participation. What makes this segregation of performers of color more striking is if you take these programs that were predominantly set overseas out of the equation, British East Asian and Southeast Asian representation in the contemporary drama genre fell by 50%. 50%. These programs are essentially overrepresenting performers of color while simultaneously othering them by making them anything but British. Segregating actors of color by painting them as foreigners is not diversity. It is tokenism. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie. So what we're going to do next is to watch a pre-recorded panel discussion with Dr. Diana Ye in conversation with Hong Kao, Lucy Sheen, and Rosa Fong. Now, the panel discussion was recorded on Zoom. And one thing I believe that we've all learned about in lockdown is that Zoom conversations are very contingent on people's internet connections. And sometimes there are lags and buffers. And there's 1 or 2 lags and buffers in this, but I'm sure that you'll still find this a very stimulating conversation. So here we are, 34 years, from Ping Pong to Monsoon.
Okay, so welcome to this morning's panel, 34 Years from Ping Pong to Monsoon. My name is Diana Ye, and I'm a senior lecturer in sociology, culture and creative industries at City University of London. I'm hugely honoured to be introducing our panellists today, who are some of the most important voices in British East and Southeast Asian film. The actor and writer Lucy Sheen, the filmmaker and academic Rosa Fong, and the filmmaker Hong Kao. So this panel is framed by 2 milestones in British East and Southeast Asian filmmaking: the release of the first ever British-Chinese feature film Ping Pong in 1986, starring Lucy Sheen, and the recent film Monsoon by Hong Kao, released in 2020, and which features for the first time a British-Vietnamese story. So we're going to take a look at short clips of both now.
Well, that's it. Everything seems to be in order. How do you come to speak such good English?
Same reason as you do.
Oh.
They say, be a benevolent person and you'll be blessed by heaven. That way you get to die in your own bed with your friends and relatives around you.
your evening classes seem to be getting longer and longer. Unless they're teaching you something I don't know about.
What is this, the Spanish Inquisition?
I've got the right to know where you've been all evening, that's all.
Drunk.
Oh,
Peter?
Elaine, I was the one that taught you everything you know, remember? And I can still teach you. Thanks. Elaine!
It's been a long time. 30 years.
If I see you in the street, I cannot recognize you. Where are you staying?
Taodian, District 2.
You should visit your old home.
Yeah, I'm going to.
You look like your picture. Thank God.
Went to where we used to live. I felt like a tourist. I hardly recognize this country anymore. I remember growing up in London. Every Vietnamese person that I met lost a family member here.
Yeah, it took a great deal out of us, too. Generation forgotten, country divided.
I had no idea that we were leaving. I went to sleep one night, and when I woke up, I was on a boat, drifted for days. My mother passed about a year ago now.
Did your parents ever come back to Vietnam?
Never.
Must be very painful for them not to come back.
Where will you scatter the ashes?
We're returning them home.
Why has it been so long for you to return?
So did you find what you wanted in Hanoi?
So Lucy, Rosa and Hong, there's been a 34-year gap between the release of these two films, and in between there have only been a very few feature films based on British East and Southeast Asian experiences. And of those, I think only yours, Hong, Lilting in 2014, alongside Ray Young's Cutsleeve Boys in 2006, have been entirely helmed by British East or Southeast Asian creative teams. So my first question is, how can we account for what amounts to an almost complete erasure of British East and Southeast Asian talent from our screens across the decades?
For me, I think it's quite hard to unpick why there has been that hiatus over the last 30 odd years between Ping Pong and Monsoon. And as you said, yeah, there have been a couple of films in between, which obviously I was the associate producer on. Cutsleeve Boys, so I'd perhaps talk about that a bit later. But I think the recent calls by many of the BAME creatives working in the industry, such as Nisha Party's open letter and the BAME task force letter to the government, have called attention to the systemic racism within the industry. And this was prevalent in the 80s, and I really think that very little has changed since then. So from my part, I really recognise that trajectory and recognise many of the points that those two letters, open letters to the industry and to the government, raised about the systemic racism within the industry.
Picking up on that, I mean, for me, it's become over the years more and more obvious to me. There is an attitudinal, there is possibly an emotional, subconscious, and indeed conscious attitude and point of view as to how British East Asians and Southeast Asians are actually viewed by not only the wider society, but also our own creative community, in as much as we still are not considered to be British.
Yeah, I don't know. I think partly probably because we are a very quiet community, we're quite, culturally, I think we just seem to be and we were probably the smallest of the ethnic minority group as well.
Yes, the community was very limited, specifically artistically, but in terms of the wider community now and the sort of numbers, one can't say that in terms of how many East Asian, Southeast Asian faces and citizens are now British. That is a complete, sort of, it's another one of those myths, along with the model minority. And yes, initially I think we suffered from actually not being particularly vocal, and those that have always been vocal, and I could include myself in that, are being shot down in flames for rocking the boat, and for maintaining that thing of you need to keep your head down. We've gone way past that, I think, which was evidenced with sort of the advocacy and activism that kind of like sort of was launched with regard to the RSC and the Orphan of Zhao. And things have moved.
I think East Asians and the Chinese have very rarely been seen part of the British community. I mean, my family, historically, my family have been here since the 1898. My grandfather came here, so we're like 4 generations of Chinese here, yet we're always perceived as other. And it's almost like that's a comfortable place for us to be positioned as other. And consequently, we don't really have an identity as being British in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lack of a sort of understanding of this country's own history, and B, it's expedient and convenient to still consider us as the sojourners, as sort of colonial chattels, as it were. Because that way you don't have to engage, that way you can control the narrative, and you're always going to be doing things in your own image, as it were, in inverted commas. Whereas if you sort of, Ping Pong was completely outside of that. It wasn't stereotypical, it wasn't the usual racial tropes that were going around during the 70s and 80s. It was like nothing that had ever been done before in terms of characterization, not having to put on stupid accents, and it was about that narrative, that position of what it meant to Elaine to be both Chinese and British, the fact that she'd never really thought about that, what it meant for the older generation, how they coped with that, the schism between culture and where they were actually placed and living. I think that's the first time that had ever been done on that scale.
So there's a sense of comfortableness, from the dominant community. They have a certain perception of us as a culture, for want of a better word, of the group of people, and to all intents and purposes, they see the familiarity when they see that reflected, that sort of almost a very stereotypical idea of what it's like to be Chinese, and consequently, when they see maybe screenplays or stories that don't reflect that slightly stereotypical idea of what we are like as a community, and when I say community, I say that in a very loose way, because obviously we're not a homogenous community, and that's perhaps is the problem. I think they see that and they say, well, that doesn't ring true. No, those characters aren't true, because it kind of doesn't reflect how they see us in those terms. When we start to write stories about ourselves, and again, this gets on to many of the points that people like Colton Lee, in his 2018 letter to the about the BFI and public funders, some of the points that he wrote, constantly being told that the characters aren't developed enough, the stories aren't developed enough, and then trying to unpick that, and then coming to an understanding and a realization, which is a similar sort of like understanding and realization that I came to feel, is that, in actual fact, what's happening is that what they're saying, well, we don't recognize those characters from a white perspective. Those are not the characters, the Chinese characters, the East Asian people that we understand. So I think that is part and parcel of some of the problems as well.
I think for me, very much, it's kind of the continuing legacies of colonial perspectives. So Britain colonised Hong Kong, but only had a semi-colonial relationship with China, and only a few relatively small colonies in Southeast Asia, such as then British Malaya. So by comparison to Black and South Asian communities, the Chinese only really occupy a kind of marginal place in British consciousness, while the rest of East and Southeast Asia is almost entirely erased. But Lucy, you mentioned how ping pong was your first break and also really pioneering in terms of really taking a complex look at diasporic Chinese lives. So I have two questions for you. First, how did that film set you up for subsequent roles that you were then going to take on? And secondly, why do you think it is that Ping Pong never reached the same status as other seminal films of the period featuring Black and Asian stories, such as My Beautiful Laundrette or Horace Ove's Playing Away?
I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, obviously at the time, I was straight up drama school, so it's my first job. When we'd finished filming Ping Pong, Malcolm Craddock, who's the co-producer and MD of Picture Palace, said, "You do realise that if you hadn't cut the mustard, we would have sacked you and hired another actress." So I kind of like felt quite proud of being able to get through that. In terms of setting me up, I might well as never have done Ping Pong, because in terms of British TV and feature further film work through the 80s and the 90s, no, I had to start from the bottom. A very good friend of mine at the time, who's happens to be white, British, and I suppose you'd call famous, pointed out to me that if I had been white and had done exactly what I'd managed to achieve, I would have invariably had at least a shot at a TV series of my own, would have done at least one West End theatre and probably a couple of feature films. Why, you know, if you want to compare like for like in this kind of like scenario, the only thing that would be different is the way that I look, my appearance, my ethnicity, my heritage. And I will leave you to draw the conclusion from that. From that point of view, yes, it meant absolutely nothing to me in terms of that scenario where other actors of different, you know, sort of heritages would have been able to take advantage of that because doors would have been opened. And that doesn't happen, or it didn't happen to me. And it's still not happening, not just to British East Asians and Southeast Asian actors and actresses, but also to other British actors of colour. It's still not happening in the same way.
So you took, you know, you were featuring as the main lead in this feature film. And what were the kinds of roles that you were then going on to be offered?
Oh, the usual takeaway, sister in takeaway, background artist, person who doesn't speak much English, illegal immigrant, non-speaking parts. You know, this will be really good for you. I've just kind of like done a lead role in a film first off, and yeah.
Didn't a similar thing happen with Po Chi as well after?
Oh yeah, Po Chi kind of, obviously his trajectory was through the BBC, doing all of the right things that you should, Panorama, etc. And in order for him to go into the field that he wanted to, he ended up having to go back to Hong Kong, learning to speak Cantonese fluently in order to become in order to basically be able to direct films.
Yeah, didn't he make because he went off to the States.
That is kind of like really sad. You know, of course he's gone on to do some huge things. So
yeah, didn't he make Crocodile Tears or something like that with Jude Law, and then after that he just went off to the States to have a
he went back to Hong Kong and did the TV series about the history of Hong Kong.
And so we relied so much on kind of, I guess, the British society or to tell our story, but hence it inevitably becomes steeped in these reductive stereotypes. I completely agree that there is an institutional way of looking at us and kind of shackling us, and we're slightly beholden to them feeling when they want to tell our stories, or have an East Asian character, or allow a filmmaker to make a film. I felt like, I remember, like, the only filmmakers I knew then was Rosa and Lab. I feel like we're not seen as a, for a long time, we haven't seen, they don't think there's an audience that wants to see our story, right? And I think Crazy Rich Asian really highlighted that. The studio, for a long time, even after the Joy Luck Club, they felt our story only appealed to our people, or that demographic. And Crazy Rich Asian blew that out of the water.
Rosa, you began making films in the late 1980s, around the same time as the release of Ping Pong. We also collaborated on some of your most recent work, the Beast films, which looks at experiences of British East and Southeast Asians working in the screen industries. Before I ask you to elaborate on your own experiences, let's first take a look at your show reel.
Beast short films use verbatim dialogue
taken from interviews with British East Asians working in cinema and television
to look at the experiences and challenges they face.
And I said, you're not going to find a more experienced Chinese screenwriter. And she said, oh no, they don't have to be Chinese.
Oh God.
At that point, I said, fuck you, and hung up.
And the play was incredibly powerful, and people seemed to like it. But it was just funny being in it with a bunch of white guys. And some of the stuff they said backstage was blatantly racist.
What kind of things?
Well, there was this one guy who used to go on about Chinese girls' vaginas all the time, that the slit goes the other way. And I'm just sitting there listening to this fucking shit, and it's in the dressing room. But I was just happy doing it, because I actually felt like a kind of actor. It makes me sad, because there are people out there, Chinese East Asian people, who are trying to be actors, and I'm not sure they ever feel like actors.
So did the brief say Chinese accent?
Chinese accent? But he wouldn't do, would he? If he went to a bloody Yorkshire school in the 70s, why the fuck would he have? He wouldn't, would he?
No.
If you are a very pretty young Asian boy and you find it hard to fit into the mainstream gay scene, nowadays a lot of them are electing to throw on a frock, because suddenly, as a lady boy, you attract a different kind of man.
And if they ask too many questions, we'll just quote Bruce.
Lee?
He was a Taoist.
The Tao of Bruce.
Cosmic breath. That saying, let's break it down. The cosmos is nature.
It looks so real. I can almost touch it.
So Rosa, going back to the late 1980s, this was a really significant time for racialized minority filmmakers, with the launch of Channel 4 and the linked creation of Black and Asian video workshops. But what were your particular experiences at that time as a British East and Southeast Asian?
The majority of people, filmmakers that I knew, were Black and Asian, and a lot of the funding that was available at the time was specifically for Black and Asian filmmakers. And I remember in particular, there was the Arts Council had an initiative for the Black Filmmakers Arts Fund. And I made an application. I was told at the time that Chinese weren't included in the term Black and Asian. So I questioned this, and then the next year they did include Chinese. So I think that kind of really illustrates this situation that we were talking about previously is why that, you know, East Asians actually have perhaps, you know, in the past have, and maybe just currently are finding it difficult to get a foothold and to get, you know, recognition as, you know, part of British community and part of a British East Asian voice in this community, because we were, even back in the 80s, we were not really recognised, and I'm not sure how much of that has changed from this point. And I just wanted to pick up on what Hong was saying about, yes, the industry is hugely competitive, you know, for everybody. But I think in particular, you know, East Asians, Black and Asian filmmakers have other factors that they need to deal with. And again, just going back to Colton Lee's letter, and he picks up on microaggression. And it's really interesting because if you're working independently in these little silos, you obviously think, well, it's just your own experience and, you know, that's just the way it is. But many of the similar experiences have been echoed, and I recognise, you know, some of the microaggressions of when people say to me, when they read the screenplay and they say, we love the screenplay, but can you make your Chinese character white instead? Or being told that my stories are too niche. And again, you know, oh, there's no audience for your type of stories. Some of those filmmakers from the early days have just got out of the industry because they've just been worn down by this constant battle of not only having to work in a very competitive industry, but then having all of these other factors that completely wear you down.
I just wanted to pick up on that point, Rosa, that you raised, because I think it's really fascinating the way in which you couch some of the experiences as microaggressions. Because I think, you know, when these so-called microaggressions are built into wider decision-making around who is allowed access to filmmaking or having their voice heard, it actually becomes very much about structural inequality. So for me, these so-called microaggressions, they really embed the way in which we are marginalized, rather than merely being instances of interpersonal racism, which, you know, and I think for me, very much the term microaggression itself kind of downplays how those interpersonal instances of racism can be connected to wider structural inequality. But what I want to ask you now is about what can be done. So we have here with us today a host of people with the power to affect real change in the industry. And I'd like to hear from each of you suggestions for practical, concrete change that can be implemented immediately.
There is no excuse. If you really want to see it change, then get out your pocketbook, write a check, and employ somebody.
Lose the fear and bring us in, you know, because we want to work within this creative community to create a more vibrant community. You know, we're not working against you.
I mean, I completely agree with everything that's been said. You know, we need more people to tell our stories. We don't need them to tell our stories. We need more people in positions of power to commission these stories. They need to nurture more filmmakers from our community through. So in order for us to tell to kind of dispel these myths and stereotypes that seems to somehow exist, is really odd.
Thank you. So I think these suggestions really make the message loud and clear about what needs to be done going forward. And I really implore audience members not only to take these thoughts home, but to ensure that they are actually put into action in the very near future. So this brings us to the end of our panel, and I'd like to thank Lucy, Rosa and Hong for sharing your experiences and insights, and also the audiences for listening. Thank you.
Yes, so just a quick reminder that if anyone has any questions for the Q&A panel, you can post them in the chat box or use the raise hand Zoom function later. And now coming up next, Emma Ko will talk about decolonizing funding.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, I'm Emma Ko. I'm mixed race, Chinese Caucasian. I have black hair, wearing slightly broken specs and a black and white top. I'm talking today about decolonizing film and TV funding. It's not what you fund, it's who you fund. So we've already talked about the poverty of BC talent on screen, and I'm now going to talk about what it's like behind the camera. Unsurprisingly, it's just as dire, if not worse. This is a clip from the Diamond data findings, breaking down the numbers by ethnicity in key behind camera roles in TV. So commissioning editors, directors, writers, producers, exec producers, and production managers. The numbers are pretty bleak for anyone not white, but when it comes to East Asians, the numbers were so insignificant, they were redacted. So when we say BCs are working from zero inclusion in the TV industry, we are not being impressionistic or metaphorical, we are being literal. In the film industry, BCs are not faring much better, as we heard in the panel discussion just now. Essentially, from 2000 onwards, there's only been 3 BC helmed films that were publicly funded and theatrically released: Hong's films, Monsoon and Lilting, and Zhao Lugo's She, a Chinese, and that's it. So I think you'll understand why we at Beats are doing all we can, because people from EC heritages in the UK are just not seeing their lives and stories reflected on screen, and we believe this has to change. But rather than being all doom and gloom, I'm going to try and be upbeat and explain to you why getting more BC stories on our screen is an opportunity, not an effort. And my opening sales pitch is this: EC content sells. As Hong said in the panel, everyone's heard about the success of Crazy Rich Asians, but there's also films like The Farewell, Lucky Grandma, Always Be My Maybe, Minari, Searching, all EC helmed films made in the last 2 years that have done incredibly well with EC and global audiences. And TV's just the same. Kim's Convenience, Fresh Off the Boat, Aquafina as Nora from Queens, Ronnie Chang, International Student, Warrior. So many shows starring EC faces, produced by EC teams, and it's not stopping, as it seems every week there's another announcement of another EC helm show or film being greenlit, but sadly none from the UK. That's not to say we haven't had EC dramas made in the last few years. We've had Chamerica, One Child, Strangers, The Singapore Grip, Giri Haji, but the difference between all those shows and the American ones is every single one from the UK was made and produced without any BC talent attached. Yes, they may have hired a cultural consultant to, as Adele Lim, the co-writer of Crazy Rich Asians, described it, sprinkle some soya sauce onto a screenplay, rather than being allowed to do the substantive work of crafting the story. This is not what we consider BC helmed, and it shows. I was going to do a session looking at the now binned CBBC show Living with the Lambs, but I wanted to look forward rather than back. But as a quick recap to do so, the show, about a Chinese family running a restaurant, was conceived by an all-white team, commissioned by a white commissioner, and written by a string of 3 white writers. The resulting scripts that were used to greenlight the show leaked. And unsurprisingly, when the racist tropes, cliched and stereotyped characters, like the inscrutable granny, who was sneezing on the oven-baked dumplings and calling it special sauce, social media went mad and the story went global. The project has since been binned. It's currently being reimagined with a writer from EC Heritage, with no plans so far for a broadcast date. That was a lot of time, money, and reputation lost, not to mention a BC show that could be on our screens right now, gone. From the moment the BC writer consulted at the beginning, but then let go, was told, the writer doesn't have to be Chinese. I suspect the all-white team involved might look back now and regret that decision hugely. Sometimes when we talk about this, we get a little pushback. People who say that there shouldn't be any boundaries set on creativity and imagination. And Beats would agree. Writers should be allowed to write anything, but only when all things are equal. And things are far from equal right now. And you've seen the stats. The truth is, there is so much talent out there and so many incredible stories to be told by this talent. At the very least, the fact there hasn't been a BC helm show on our screen for years is a massive open goal to get something genuinely fresh and entertaining to audiences with too much choice, but yet where everything feels constantly familiar. So let's say you are thinking about developing a BC or EC themed project. Brilliant. But please think about who you hire to start that journey with. If you're an all-white team and you want to adapt Sweet Mandarin or make a film about the true story of the repatriated Liverpool Chinese, please do so with someone who can help you make that project better. Why waste money hiring someone to sprinkle soya sauce when you can hire a talented BC team who possess the vital lived-in experience to do these stories justice and will help you bring that story to life authentically, creatively, and yes, with quality. Quality, that old excuse. Please make no mistake, the unconscious bias that exists, that means men still make most of our scripted content, extends to racist unconscious bias too. which means that the gaze that falls on the majority of our screen content is predominantly male, white, and of a certain professional background. Is it any surprise, therefore, that behind the camera, things are being whitewashed? And the consequences of this are severe. Marginalized storytellers are getting shut out of telling their own stories, perpetuating exclusion and the systemic silencing of a marginalized community. And right now, with Trump's constant Kung flu and Chinese virus rhetoric, people of Chinese appearance are being brutally beaten and abused on the streets here and there, which means the importance of more and better BC representation is more vital than ever. Humanizing BC people on our screens becomes a responsibility now. So how do we start? Well, if we genuinely want a fair industry, we have to disrupt the patterns of behavior that have led to the appalling stats we at Beats are banging on about. We have to dismantle the conditions which have led to this point. Everyone must be active in interrogating who gets to tell stories, not just what stories get made. This clip is a very handy tool if you're unsure, borrowed from our friends at the Iraqi Diaspora Creative Network. I won't go through all of it because I believe the materials we're using will be sent on to you afterwards, but basically the question is this: is the story you have in mind your story to tell? Is it your history, culture, religious background, and/or heritage represented in the story? If it is, then great, go ahead and make it. If the answer is no, then have you spoken to a wide range of creators from the community you want to portray? And note, wide range is really key here. If no, then ask yourself, why are you creating this story? If it's because you think it's important, then the creative team needs to be led and predominantly made up of creatives from the community you are portraying. It's pretty simple. We are asking you today not to perpetuate a systemic racist industry anymore. Please start interrogating not only what stories you want to tell, but who should be telling them. So production companies and producers, fund and hire BC writers, directors, and producers as your main creative team, and then let them helm those stories from the beginning. Do not co-opt BC stories because you think you know what a Chinese family running a restaurant is like because your favorite cuisine is dim sum and you've been to Hong Kong on holiday. Broadcasters, commit to commissioning one BC Helm show a year. Tell your content providers you will prioritize this as a commissioning goal until you've greenlit at least one show. Everyone, explore our Beats Fellowship and directories to find BC talent. Subscribe to the Beam Network on Facebook to find wider BC behind the camera talent. In an industry that, especially now, after the Black Lives Matter movement gathered so much momentum, incredible momentum last year, and conversations are increasingly about diversity and inclusion, know that talk is nothing without action. Without real actions, allyship becomes an exercise in optics. It is not real substantive change. So come on, let's get the UK version of Crazy Rich Asians in the can. Let's see Korean Doc Martin on ITV1 primetime. Let's get a load of BC talent together in a room and come up with our version of Stranger Things. Together we can make amazing programs, so let's just do it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. And next up is Beck Bowie launching our very own Beats test.
Hi, I'm Beck. Yeah, that's right. Hi, I'm Beck. My pronouns are she, her. I've got short brown hair and I'm wearing a black jumper. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. How's that? So, oh God, I've gone too far. So we're launching the Beats test today, which is a simple test to measure British East and Southeast Asian on-screen representation in British film and television productions. The Beats test isn't a barometer of quality. We're not film critics, nor is it a stick to hit you with or any form of censorship. We don't have that power. This test, we want it to become a standard for the industry to seek to achieve. Please see passing the Beats test as something positive to aspire to, a kind of gold star from us. To pass the Beats test, you must answer yes to these 3 questions. 1, are there 2 or more BC characters? 2, do at least 2 BC characters speak fluent English with a British accent? 3, does at least 1 BC character pursue their own goal separate to the white characters? So that seems like quite a low bar we're setting there. Very simple questions. I'm sure that lots of films are going to pass. So let's put a few films and television shows to the test, starting with this first question, which relates to tokenism. For a production to pass the Beats test, the BC presence must not feel tokenistic, i.e. one token Asian who is there as lip service to diversity, whose presence feels like a symbolic gesture or a box tick. Obviously, this is a very complex and difficult thing to prove. So in the interest of simplicity, we've decided that to pass our test and achieve our gold standard, you must have more than one BC character. Harry Potter had only one BC character, Cho Chang, over 8 films, so it does not pass. Gemma Chan was the only BC in this, and she was a robot, so doesn't pass. Killing Eve doesn't pass. Only Sandra Oh's character was BC. The others were a foreign diplomat, a foreign businessman, and a foreign spy. BBC's One Child doesn't pass. Katie Lung's character was the only BC. ITV's The Singapore Grip, I think you can probably guess, doesn't pass. This show was set in Singapore, and although there was one BC actor involved, she was playing a Chinese woman. Channel 4's Chimerica doesn't pass. This show was set in Beijing, and although there were BC actors involved, none of them was playing BC. Strangers from ITV also doesn't pass. This show was set in Hong Kong, and although there were BC actors involved, again, none of them were playing BC characters. Channel 4 Flowers doesn't pass either. Will Sharp was the only BC in this. Shudder's horror movie, The Host. I loved this film, and Gemma Moore, pictured here, was arguably the lead, but she's the only BC, so it doesn't pass. Monsoon doesn't pass. This is a great film for EC representation, but it doesn't pass on BC representation because although the lead is British, he's the only one in the film. However, Hong Kao's other movie, Lilting, passes with 3 BC characters. Ping Pong passes with a cast of 23 BC characters. The Chinese Detective, it doesn't pass. David Yip was the only BC for most of the series. A couple of individual episodes do pass, but overall we feel that his isolation as the only Chinese one makes this representation tokenistic. Let's bear in mind though, this is a television show from 1981. It's quite telling that I'm even having to use this as an example. Last Christmas passes. Henry Golding and Michelle Yeoh both play BCs. The Foreigner, it passes. Katie Lung and Jackie Chan both play BCs. The Receptionist passes with 4 BC lead women. And to clarify, as Jen said earlier, when we say British EC, we're not referring to anything to do with citizenship or passports. Although the lead characters in The Receptionist are migrant workers, they live and work in the UK, so we consider them British. Giri Haji passes with 2 BCs, one mixed race Anglo-Japanese character played by Will Sharp and a Japanese gangster who has relocated to London and is therefore BC. The second question, do at least 2 BC characters speak fluent English with a British accent? Accents are often signifiers of foreignness, of otherness, a marker of newness to the UK. We at Beats are all either immigrants or children of immigrants, so we appreciate the importance of migrant voices. We believe that films with first-generation BCs with overseas accents have their place in our story. But what we're trying to encourage with this question about accents is portrayals of BCs as 2nd, 3rd, and even 4th generation, as people who have been here a long time, people who were born here, people who grew up here, people who don't have anywhere to go back to. So with this in mind, let's see which productions make it past question 2. Channel 4's Giri Haji doesn't pass. Only Will Sharp speaks in a British accent. The Receptionist passes. The film is mainly in Mandarin, but there are some scenes in English, and the supporting BC characters speak in British accents. The Foreigner doesn't pass. I mean, the clue's in the title here. Jackie Chan's character speaks in a Chinese accent, and in this case, his accent is a definite signifier of his foreignness. Last Christmas doesn't pass. Oding's character speaks in a British accent. He's also just a figment of... Ping Pong Passes. The leads, Elaine and Mike, both speak in British accents, and they're not the only ones. They're supported by a whole diverse cast of British East and Southeast Asian characters. And lilting. Passes. Although Pei Cheng's character doesn't speak English at all, and the story hinges on her inability to integrate, the other two BCs, played by Andrew Lung and Naomi Christie, speak English in British accents. Question 3, does at least one BC character pursue their own goals separate from the white characters? This question is here to make sure that the BC characters have a narrative that isn't tied to or secondary to a white lead. In other words, they don't exist purely for the purposes of furthering a white character's story. So this is about agency and about three-dimensional depictions that go beyond service to a white narrative. Lilting. Passes. Naomi Christie's character is a translator hired by Ben Whishaw, and she doesn't have a narrative outside of the white characters. But Andrew Lung's character Kai has his own story. Ping Pong. Passes. Lucy Sheen's character arc is the main subject of the film, and the handful of white characters are absolutely peripheral. Not only do the BC stories take center stage here, there is a wonderful mixture of first and second generation BC characters, and the film's central obsession is the BC dual heritage experience. The Receptionist. Passes. This story focuses on Teresa Daly's character, and the white characters are very much peripheral. There's no question that the BC characters have their own goals and story arcs, and the supporting BC characters also have their own, albeit nefarious, goals. Tellingly though, if you look at the IMDb for The Receptionist, all the supporting white actors are listed way above the lead cast. Again, that's for another day. So 3 passes out of 17. For such a simple set of questions, it's quite incredible how few productions pass all 3. It would seem that passing this test is actually quite a radical and groundbreaking achievement, and it shouldn't be that way. For British East and Southeast Asians to become a normalised, naturalised presence on our screens, and in turn in the fabric of British life and society, we're going to need a few more productions to be making an effort to pass the Beats test. We can't force you, but we really hope that you want to. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. And so we're now taking questions from the audience, and this will be chaired by Dr. Diana Ye.
Thank you, Jennifer. So yes, welcome to the Q&A and discussion session or part of this event. So I'm Diana. I have black hair tied up, and I'm wearing a red jumper with some spots on my shoulders. So I hope you have found the presentations today enlightening, informative, even if at times they may have felt a little bit uncomfortable. That's to be expected, and we are we encourage you to kind of like participate in a discussion with us to kind of move forward. So we have time to take some questions from the floor, and I'll invite you to raise your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom. I hope you know how to do that. And whilst people are perhaps just having a few moments to gather their thoughts, what I would broadly say is that, you know, in terms of the questions and the kind of discussion, please do ask questions about all the different parts of the event. So we have most of the speakers here, and I'm sure all of them will be happy to expand on various parts of their presentations. I do have a particular question that might be helpful in terms of thinking about the Beats test, because I think in a sense, it's such a fantastic tool like the Bechdel test, but there are kind of like always questions that arise in relation to tests such as this. You know, so one example might be, what if my British East and Southeast Asian characters speak in Welsh? Does that mean that it passes the test or not. So Beck, would you mind perhaps clarifying that?
Yes. So to clarify that, I mean, question 2 mentions English specifically for the sake of simplicity, as it's the majority language, but we appreciate that there are other UK languages, you know, Irish Gaelic, Scottish, Welsh, BSL, and we don't want to not pass a test because of that, because they're speaking in those languages. We absolutely want to embrace those languages as well. So yeah, you would pass if your characters are speaking in those languages. And I apologize that we have to keep the questions so simple, and therefore it might feel like we're not including certain languages, but UK languages across the board, you would pass the test on that.
Great, thank you. I don't see any raised hands at the moment, so I don't know if people are still sort of gathering their thoughts. I guess one thing that I think is also perhaps important to clarify around the BEATS test is, you know, that kind of thing about does it mean that if my film hasn't passed the BEATS test, does that mean it's bad somehow? Does that mean it kind of like loses its value?
Definitely not. I've made things that don't pass. We want to see it as something that you should be seeking to achieve, as a kind of benchmark that you want to head towards. We don't want it to be something to hit you with. And also, like I said, it's not a barometer of quality. You could make a terrible film pass the BEATS test, as long as it's not in any way racist. We definitely wouldn't pass a film if it was racist and somehow managed to get through the 3 questions. It's like the Bechdel test. You know, you could technically pass that and still have made a very unfeminist film, but no one would be falling over themselves to praise the feminist message in your film just because you'd managed to squirm your way through the test.
Brilliant. Thanks, Beck. That's really helpful clarification. Okay, we have a question now about basically the next step for BC representation on screen after the BEATS test has been implemented. So what would be the bare minimum? And again, you know, Beck doesn't have to take the responsibility for answering all of the questions. The rest of BEATS, please feel free to come in if you think you can tackle that question. So the question is, what is the next step for BC representation on screen after the BEATS test has been implemented?
Well,
go on. Oh, sorry, Beck, gone.
No, you go. I've spoken loads.
Well, I was just going to say that I think now that we have launched the BEATS test, it is just a really good, like the clip that I showed, I think it's just a really good handy guide that if you are, you know, for any film, regardless of whether it's BC project or not, it's just, I think it's one of those things that is just a kind of a thought provoker when making films that tend to be that when we're talking about diversity and inclusiveness, and that can't be a bad thing, I think. So just in terms of going forward, just using it, even if you can't pass it, but having it in the back of your mind, I think is something about being conscious about something that is really, really positive and a good step forward.
Yeah, also the BEATS test is for on-screen representation. So, you know, if we get to the point where we've managed to have a lot of things passing the BEATS test, which would be wonderful and is definitely our aim. The next step is, of course, not just on-screen representation, but behind-screen representation as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, fantastic. Again, you know, it would be really great if some more audience members would like to join the discussion. I guess this is an opportunity really for you to ask BEATS about the kind of work we do, about how we can help you move forwards. I do have a few more questions in the chat, but I kind of want to, in a sense, give you the opportunity to come in. So perhaps even if you don't have a particular question, it will be really interesting for us to hear some responses to what you've heard today, if you feel able to share them.
There's a couple in the chat now from some of our audience.
Okay, great. So Right. I will take the one first about how can other people of colour be allies for BCs in the industry?
I mean, I think it's a question of basically showing support in the same way that other groups have showed support during the BLM, and actually being aware of the issues that are similar but also different for cultural reasons and other reasons about various different sections of British society. And I think if the industry as a whole can actually understand that there are certain sensitivities and things that we need to bear in mind when we are producing work from another particular community, then the same courtesy should be extended to the wider community of the BCs. So I just think it's growing that understanding and that sensitivity that helps us all become inclusive and enriches what we do. So it's not just about, you know, sort of excluding people and going on to the next kind of like tick box or people, let's make films about this particular group because it's become a thing. We should have all of that. That should add to the strands so that our culture, our filmmaking, what happens on television is truly inclusive, diverse, and reflects the amazing history and diversity of this country.
Great, thank you. So some of the really interesting comments are coming in, some with questions and some without. I'm not sure if we'll have time to go through everything, so I'll just pick out those, just a few of them. So there's one comment here. I was really struck and horrified by the lack of BC representation in commissioning execs. It is a key thing to have more people from the community in positions of power and influence. Emma.
I can jump in here.
Please do.
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is yes. Definitely in terms of BC talent, but I also just think, you know, it's a wider discussion about inclusiveness and diversity. I think if there are more commissioning editors and gatekeepers who have confronted the obstacles, the systemic obstacles that we've all talked about, there is an understanding in terms of what they're reading and the stories that they're being asked, you know, being asked to commission, that they might understand in a way that somebody who hasn't wouldn't. And I think that's one of the biggest, the kind of biggest takeaways from today is that if you are reading something, and again, there's more materials we can send out, but Nikesh Shukla has a really great series of questions about and interrogating your own thought processes when you're given something to read in terms of relatability and what is relatable and who's relatable, and if it's not relatable to you, why? And I think those kind of questions are really great. And the more, I mean, my belief is the more it becomes something that's conscious in our minds when we're reading stuff, especially if we don't like it, it's to ask, is it about, is it genuinely about just it's not very good, or it's not something I want to commission, or is it something deeper than that that's unconscious?
Great. Would anyone else like to come in before we move on to some of the other questions? Okay, so this is another question. This is a good step, the BEATS test, and we know that tests like the Bechdel and RIS are useful. However, if we are still reliant on people opting in to better practices and considering BC representation, do you think change will come quickly enough? What is your ask of production funders to use their power to force this change and accelerate it?
That's a really good question, because like I said in the presentation, we can't force you to listen to what we're saying. We don't have that power. We are just, you know, 20 activists working really hard in a not-for-profit. We really hope that people want to make these changes, but we can't force it. What we are doing is we're having a lot of meetings with commissioners and production companies, and we're asking them to make commitments. So far, they're not really making those commitments. They're making you know, encouraging sounds, but we haven't seen any actions yet. So I suppose our ask is, I mean, the proof will be in the pudding. So our ask is commission BC writers, BC directors, fully BC teams, and make that first British East and Southeast Asian television show, because it doesn't exist.
Can I just say something?
Of course.
As well. I mean, in my research, it's pretty clear that what is still happening is people who are doing the casting, directors, casting directors, etc., the default is still to get in white characters. And the excuse that people are using for not hiring people of color, and the scale goes, down to the bottom where BC and the Middle Eastern, North African heritage people are. It is the excuse is always like they don't have enough experience. Well, if you don't get experience, they're not going to give it to you. But I really don't understand why in this day and age, people of all, backgrounds aren't being brought in to do the modern roles. In contemporary drama, which is where the networks, certainly for the year I monitored, were basically, just shoving all their diversity statistics into 5 shows, and people weren't being hired for a lot of the other things. So that mindset has got to change, or nothing is going to happen, and that is up to people who have the power at the moment. So that's my thoughts on that right now.
Great, thank you, Jamie. We have a few questions. Oh, sorry, Lucy, did you want to come in first?
No, I just wanted to pick up on what Bex and Jamie has said in the sense that there is a mindset, I think, and I encountered that very early on doing ping pong, that you make the product and then that's enough. We've done that, we can move on. And that absolutely was proved not to be the case when Ping Pong went to Venice, and it did extremely well in spite of a lot of, I think, hurdles that were put in front of it. And eventually when it got to the States, it did very well. We were reviewed extremely well with, sort of the major European press. And it was Alexander Walker who said, "Why has this film not been supported like My Beautiful Laundrette?" And we have to ask ourselves these hard questions. Why, back in the 80s, when a film that could have done exactly the same that My Beautiful Laundrette did for the British South Asian population, didn't do it for the British Southeast Asian population? And in my humble opinion, it's down to will and view. And it is, as Jamie said, that was out of our hands. It's down to the people that had the power to actually do that, to support that film. And it wasn't. And that's a crying shame, given that it played back to black in Canada with My Beautiful Laundrette in a cinema for 2 years. People want to go and see the content. It isn't niche. And I think that's an excuse. Especially these days, it's very much an excuse. And that was the excuse that was given 34 years ago.
Great, thank you, Lucy. I think, unfortunately, I'm just keeping a note on the time, and we actually have many questions now flowing in, but we have actually come to the end of the possible time for this session. So what we will do is hopefully you will be receiving some follow-up materials from this session, and we encourage you to keep in discussion with Beats. We will be taking the questions that you've posed us away with us, and perhaps we can somehow respond to those additional questions that have been posted. But for the time being, I would like to thank all the panelists and all the audience members for their participation. It's great to hear that despite people feeling that this has been sort of slightly depressing in terms of understanding what the challenges are, that you have found it a kind of constructive and hopeful session. So I'd now like to pass back to Jennifer Lim for her closing remarks and recommendations.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, so in the next 5 minutes, I would like to put across very succinctly, in the interest of time, the moral, business, and creative case for more BC representation, and to make some recommendations. So according to a quantum physicist, reality is what we take to be true. And what we take to be true is what we believe. And what we believe is based upon our perceptions. And what we perceive determines what we believe. And what we believe determines what we take to be true. And what we take to be true is our reality. So it's a vicious cycle. If we don't see the lights of ourselves represented on our screens, we effectively don't exist. And on the few and rare occasions when we do, our representation is accompanied by stereotypic tropes and an exaggerated sense of false reality refracted through a Western prism that adversely affects the way the rest of society perceives us. That's the moral case. And before lockdown became a way of life. Now, 2019 was a triumphant year for Asian Americans, with a slew of films and programs featuring predominantly East and Southeast Asian casts. Stories penned by East and Southeast Asian writers and directors. So I'm thinking off the top of my head, The Farewell, Always Be My Maybe, Nora from Queens, to name a few. Now, they all received critical and box office acclaim. Now, East and Southeast Asians in the global North are hungry to see themselves represented on screen. And this is an area of audience development that is still relatively untapped into in the UK. So I think there is a business case here for developing this latent British East and Southeast Asian audience group. Though I must hasten to add that I personally don't think that this should be the primary driver for change. The creative case. So the towering shadows of COVID-19 and Brexit have shifted the ground from under our feet in many ways. Though the ramifications can render us and our organizations vulnerable, this can also be a time for reflection and renewal. So when this enforced break is over, we cannot return to business as usual. The focus must be on addressing past imbalances and reducing deficits and structural gaps in the film and TV industry. Now, diversity and creativity are intrinsically linked. A different perspective, a new approach, and the inclusion of BCs will fire creativity and further enrich the creative world with fresh thinking and innovation. And in the remaining 2 minutes, I'm going to make some recommendations. So my first recommendation is actually very simple. It's a game that we can all play after this summit is over. It's called Spot the BC on our screens, and see how many films or TV shows that you watch in the coming days, weeks, or months pass the Beats test. A bit of a spoiler alert here. You may find this a frustrating experience. Now, there are many existing well-meaning development and entry-level schemes about. We need to move on from that. So my second recommendation is this: commit to getting more BC talent into the room, be they actors, writers, directors, or producers. It's time for the wider industry to get behind us with concrete commissions and to take advantage of our skills and expertise. I mean, get BC writers in your writers' room. Be innovative in terms of casting, for instance. I mean, why not be the first to break new ground and put more than one BC character in a period drama or any type of drama? I'm not fussed. So we've seen that Netflix has led the way. Bridgerton is a living testimony that diversity sells. And I also like to recommend that today's summit isn't a one-off event. I and my colleagues would very much like all of us to get together again in 2022, and hopefully that we can all be in the same physical space together and see where things have moved on then. And I know that we all lead very busy lives, but in order for change to happen and to make the industry a more equitable place, we need your commitment and buy-in. And I know that this is not a workshop, but please do write down one thing that you can do to better BC representation in the coming year. And you don't need to share this with anyone. And let us revisit this in 12 months' time and evaluate the impact of your commitment. And I believe we are now nearing the end of the summit. So thank you very much for taking the time out to join us. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of Beats, all the contributors to today's program. And a big thank you again to BFI and ITV for partnering with Beats to make this event possible. And a huge shout out to Rico, who has supported us so magnificently on the tech front. And we want to keep these conversations going, as Diana says, and to continue the dialogue. So if there were any questions that didn't get asked earlier because we ran out of time, please feel free to email us at Beats, and Rico will help to put the email address up. So till we meet again, stay safe, take care, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.